the Turkish domestic market. And Turkey has other political, economic interests with Russia, but energy is a strong one. It'll work it very carefully, but in the end, Turkey will find a way to look out for its own interests. And I think it sits in an interesting position right now because it doesn't really need any of this gas. It's also trying to reduce gas volumes under take-or-pay contracts and reduce what it pays for gas. So it doesn't feel rushed to reach a settlement. But I think it will deal very carefully with both of these projects.
However, there are some concerns raised at the energy conference the day before yesterday that Turkey as well is a growing market apart from being a transit country. So, Mr. Dolezal pointed out that the demand in the country, the domestic demand, is rising. So there is some potential for Turkey to buy this gas, not only to transit.
Well, that's true, except, as we saw from last year, even Turkey couldn't take all the gas it was contracted to take. Turkey has always exaggerated its gas demand, and I'm sure that with a country of 70 million people, yes, demand will grow. To what extent, and to what extent can Turkey bring in LNG? It has gas from Iran it can bring in, or Turkmenistan, at least for its domestic market, and it's developing its offshore fields. So, Turkey does have other options. Blue Stream delivers gas, so it's not as if it's going to be desperately in need of gas from South Stream and Nabucco.
And Nabucco needs far more than Azerbaijan can supply, as we already discussed, especially after pledging to support South Stream in the first place. And again, this is the discussion of to which direction will Azerbaijan turn, whether Russia or the West. But what about the prospects for participation of Iran and Iraq in the Nabucco project and the role of U.S. foreign policy in that issue?
I think both Iran and Iraq are longer term to the degree that in Iraq it's not clear how much gas there will be available for export, and even the companies involved in Nabucco that are exploring in Iraq don't know what they're going to be able to export from Iraq into this pipeline. But it has a better prospectivity to the degree that you're going to have U.S. support for that versus Iran. Iran remains a big question mark, and even if Iran were able to become a bigger player in gas exports, I've always wondered to what extent Iran would link its southern gas fields into the Middle East region. It has neighboring countries, Bahrain, UAE, Oman, which potentially could use its gas as well. And so will Iran just focus initially on pipelines in its own region and gas reinjection for its big oil fields? How much gas will Iran have to export to Europe? It's a very long way. And finally, I guess I would add that because you have the Chinese companies so heavily involved now in Iran and also in Iranian gas and other Asian companies, it's really the direction that Iran is going to take with its gas in the future, not necessarily Europe, but Asia.
And regarding the U.S. foreign policy alone, despite the strenuous efforts of the U.S. government to discourage foreign companies from investing in Iran, or concerns that the money could be used to support the nuclear weapons program in the country, Iran has found no shortage of takers. For example, we've seen that SKS Ventures of Malaysia planning to invest $15 billion. Statoil Norway planning to invest $2.65 billion. And I think that the agreement was confirmed in late 2008. China is a big player and a big investor there, and doesn't seem to want to move out with $2 billion.
I think of all of these that you list, I think the one that's most serious is China, and it's not just Sinopec, but it's the MPC as well. And this question of how does U.S. foreign policy affect the business and political climate in Iran, I think it affects it to the extent that companies like Statoil will not be investing. I think the Malaysians have some investments there. I don't know about SKS, whether it will put $16 billion, but certainly the Asians in general are looking at Iran as Indians as well as a market where they want to invest and produce gas. Regardless of the sanctions, I think the Europeans are supporting the U.S. very strongly. The Russians may even support the U.S., but the Chinese so far have said they do not want sanctions. And China may be the holdout on all of this because they see Iran as an important energy producer for themselves in the future.
And to finish with, what future is there for international oil companies? What will their relationship with national governments be?
I think the international oil companies realize they need to have relationships with national oil companies. The real question going forward is, do national oil companies want to have relationships with the international oil companies, or do national oil companies believe, certainly at these high oil prices, that they can just buy services from service companies? I think this is where the international companies are having to adjust to how they also do business, and Iraq is a very good example of that. The types of contracts that were signed there were more along the lines of service contracts, and so the international industry is trying to adjust to this new world, and it's going to be difficult. But what you see international companies doing is looking for new niches for themselves. They were never involved in shale gas before, for example. It was very small companies that no one had heard of in the U.S. that developed the technologies and the expertise. And now you have the international oil companies thinking maybe that's a niche they can go in as well because, you know, it gets them into countries where they can get access to do that. Oil sands is another one. Because the national governments aren't giving them access to normal oil and gas reserves.
Don't you think that this relationship can possibly hinder the public interest in that? Because we see that from the political level, we are not certain about whose interest that they might protect. This is especially true for Bulgaria, where we have top-level officials actually lobbying for international oil companies and eventually, if we can say so, for international interests.
International oil companies would come to Bulgaria, I imagine, if there were prospectivity. I mean, they get involved in Turkey now, offshore, as I was saying, and Romania. But, you know, and these are the countries where, if they're welcomed, they would come, because certainly there's enough countries that don't welcome the international oil industry, but even Ukraine doesn't welcome them. But unfortunately for Bulgaria, there just must not be enough here for the big companies like Exxon to be coming offshore. That would be my guess. Otherwise, they'd be here. But it is a danger for the world to the extent that if you think about the way Qatar has gone about the business, by letting oil companies come in, develop these mega projects, they're expensive, they're complicated, they require a lot of management skills. You know, Exxon even had to build a receiving terminal in Italy to carry out, you know, the sales of their LNG from Qatar. But that is really the model that ensures security for the world. And I suppose that's the other aspect of energy security, is that if you're going to marginalize companies that are able to develop these resources in a timely, efficient way, even in Turkmenistan, they're big onshore gas fields. Even in Russia, you could argue that for gas, Sakhalin, the reason Sakhalin has been a success is the international oil companies. The Russian companies couldn't do Sakhalin. They're not experts in that kind of hostile and offshore environment. If you don't allow international companies to do these projects, which are increasingly more complicated in some parts of the world, then you're going to be left with, you know, less energy and non-transparency and a world that is less secure. And that's where, you know, you get into these issues of, okay, how can we deal with that, and renewables, alternatives, and something else that makes a country less dependent on these types of volatile resources.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.